From the center of the universe, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, this is the SDM Show with your host, Rob Cairns. The SDM Show focuses on business, life, productivity, digital marketing, WordPress, and more. Sit back, relax, grab your favorite drink, and enjoy the show. Here is Rob.
Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here. I'm the founder and CEO and chief creator of Amazing Ideas at Stunning Digital Marketing. As many of you know, I love interviewing authors, and this is no exception. I want to welcome Maddy Osman, the author of Writing for Humans and Robots, The New Rules of Content Style, to the podcast. Please grab a drink, sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation that Maddy and I had. This episode of the SDM Show is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency to handle all your WordPress website security needs. Go on over to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and find out how we can help you secure your website so you no longer have an issue with backups, being hacked, or your website being compromised. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here. And today I'm here with authors. I love authors. And I want to talk about Maddy Osman's book, Writing for Humans and Robots. How are you today, Maddy?
I'm doing great. It's the end of the day and we're finishing out strong with the podcast. So happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for agreeing to come on. I was saying to you before we went to record, this is probably one of the best writing books I have ever read. So that says a lot. And thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you for being such a great supporter. I was telling you before we recorded that it's really such a compliment. I think any author to hear that somebody liked what you created. You know, even if you can see that like it's selling and things are happening, to just get that feedback is life-changing.
Mm-hmm. It sure is. I know you spent some time in the WordPress space, and I always like to ask people what their WordPress origin story is. So how'd you get into this space?
I love that.
Is there a good story, Maddy?
Yeah. I think just like anybody else, you know, you try a bunch of different things and nothing's quite that perfect fit. So I was in college and it was my first sort of non-grocery store college job, you know, almost an adult job, but within the confines of still being a student. And I was working as a web designer at my school's Department of Student Life department. And so we worked with a lot of like student organizations and like the bookstore and different like events on campus and creating their web presence and any other marketing materials around that. And so we actually used a content management system called Silver Stripe, which is, I guess, like Australian based. And we liked it because it's kind of like basic PHP, and you could generate like a front end, place where we could pass it off to somebody in a student org who had no idea what web design is or how to code or anything like that. And they could easily change certain variables that we would find. And so that worked for a lot of what we did, but we like to experiment with different content management systems, have also played around with Drupal. I think we might have built a website with Joomla at one point. And so we had one of our student organizations that needed a new website came in and they said, well, we really want to use WordPress, at least for the blog component. And so that was my first experience, even just playing around with WordPress. And I just loved how intuitive it was, at least to me as a website designer, you know, going in with the perspective of having tried a lot of other tools and, how customizable it was. I think those things really stood out to me. And really since that project, I haven't turned back.
Oh, that's amazing. So let's jump into the book. I think, as I said, you did a really good job. And I want to highlight right off the top, one of the things you talked about in the book is consistency. And
Mm-hmm.
consistency in your writing, consistency in your layouts, and consistency in what you do. How important is that?
I mean, it's everything. And I think it's sometimes it's like do as I say, not as I do, because I think when it comes to like a marketing agency, like we're so good at everybody else's content that sometimes ours falls to the wayside. And that is something that I talk to my team about all the time. Like, it's really important that we follow, that we practice what we preach. But consistency, I think even just from a Google perspective, if you're just considering wanting to rank high in relevant search, assuming that you've done everything right to get there, it's important because Google, they're looking for consistency. They're looking for timely updates. And so if your publishing calendar is all over the place, then to that, it's almost like a distrusting factor for Google. And it's hard to quantify exactly like what is consistency. How does Google process that? But I think it's pretty safe to say that if you're publishing, for example, once a week and you're consistently doing that, that you have enough content to do that, you have a good system and process around that, then that is a positive signal to Google.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in marketing, consistency is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing, I'm kind of looking at chapter 8 right now, and this one's a bane in my sights. You know where I'm going, is guidelines for using images in online content. And I want to preface this by saying, before we even get into the guidelines, be really careful about the images people use. People have a tendency, they get on the internet, they do a search, they download an image, they throw it on their website, and then they get a phone call from Getty Images. Had this happen to clients, and they call me and say, "What do I do?" And I say, "If they want a couple $1,000, give it to them now." And they say, "But I don't want to give it to them." I said, "You want to end up in court?"
Right.
And we're talking that whole issue, of course, around copyright. So, what are some of the keys around images, and what do you suggest?
Sure. I mean, I think first of all, if there's ever a question as to whether that image is something that you can legally use, I think the best thing that you can do is try to reach out to the creator, which you might assume is where you found the image, but you might need to dig deeper than that and do something like a reverse image search to try to track down, the very original source where it came from. But anyway, just the idea that you're reaching out, you're asking questions, and also that you're providing a proper source when you use that image. I think even when we're using, say, for example, stock photos, which is not something that we typically do, but if it's some sort of asset that comes from, like a marketplace or something like that, we have our writers include the original source of the image, whether that makes it to the final published document or not. It's important that we have that as kind of like a receipt, really, in case a client comes to us and says, "Where did you get this image?" We can easily tell based on our documentation. And so I think that's one big thing. Another thing, just kind of going back to the book itself, is just the idea of different types of licensing. And so there are a lot of images that you can use that are fine to use for like any sort of personal project you have. But once it becomes a business purpose, once it needs to be commercially licensed, then certain images, maybe even half of the ones that you have access to or whatever, just in terms of like your own searches and coming across things, they may no longer be usable to you because of that specific licensing factor. So part of it is, ask if you don't know, kind of do your research to track down an original source as you would with like a statistic, but also just understanding different types of licensing. And if you are using an image correctly, even if you have access to it for one purpose, but you really need it for a different purpose.
No, I so hardly agree. And what I would even add is, if you're a retail store or you're in that business, maybe use your own images. And I'll give you an example of that. I have a client who's got a jewelry store, good friend of mine in the Toronto area. And it so happens he's a professional photographer by trade before he got in the jewelry business. And many, many years ago, I said to him, "Don't use stock photos. You're a photographer. Shoot your own." And it's a good chance to show off what they have in the store, a good chance to show off work, but it also is more personal.
No, I think that's such a great point, is to like create your own stock photos. Like maybe hire a photographer for a day and just try to anticipate what your content needs are ongoing. Both maybe you plan to update your website in general, so you need some new hero images, feature images, things like that, but also, blog content that you would tend to work on. And so for me, something that would be a stock photo for my brand might be like images of street art, because that's kind of the branding that the Blacksmith follows, our logo, just our kind of look and feel. And so it's like whenever I'm on a trip or something, I'm looking for, something that fits that aesthetic. And I think that no matter what your business is, you could create your own stock file thinking towards the future, or even planning an editorial calendar and working backwards from that. I think that's such a great idea.
The street art angle is really interesting because I have a good friend of mine. His Twitter handle is @GraffitiBMXCop. And what he does, his name is Scott Mills. He used to be the social media guy for Toronto Police, and he's very much involved in the graffiti community, trying to get kids not to do street art and not to do ambo graffiti all over the place. So I just find that tie-in so interesting. So that's well done. Let's jump into style sheets.
Sure.
I had ignored style sheets for a long, long time. And then I took a contract, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, where I did email work, but I actually worked in a communications department. And so I was kind of doing a marketing role, but under a comms banner. And we talked a lot about style sheets. Why are style sheets important for a business?
It's important whether you're just working for yourself, if you're creating it for you, but it's especially important if you're going to be working with somebody else. And the idea is that you are kind of taking some time to think about your brand, think about the things that are important in terms of your brand, defining, say, for example, tone of voice, sharing any other relevant details about, for example, do you use sentence case or title case in headings? And it comes back to the idea of consistency. You're setting sort of the foundation for how you want any content that represents your brand to look and feel and to read. And by doing that, then you can create consistency across every piece of content you create. And it's really supposed to be a time saver, I would say, because taking that idea of like, do we do sentence case or title case? I could certainly go back and look at like the last blog I wrote for the Blacksmith, or, 5 posts back. But without having defined that rule, there may actually be an inconsistency between looking at the most recent one, looking at, 5 previous to that. And so not having that rule defined, it kind of just gets in your own way. But even if you were consistent without having the document, it's still an effort to have to open it up, to, look for an example, to take note of that, and then to go back into your writing without sort of establishing a rule that you can use from here on out that's easily referenceable. I think when it comes to writing in general, creating content, really just like creating anything, it's really easy to get distracted during that process, and it takes you away from just getting finished. And so what I try to do with anything in our writing process that I'm asking people on my team to follow is like, where can I cut out distractions? And I think a style guide helps to facilitate that.
Yeah, I would agree. Should you be writing for humans, or you should be writing for robots, or you should be writing for both?
I personally think that you can write for both. And I think that the way that you do that is by first starting with the human and really holding the human's needs higher than a robot's. Because at the end of the day, it's the human that can actually buy from you. They're the ones that you're creating this content for. If your goal is to sell something or even, just to get eyes on something. And so the robot, their role is to facilitate getting you to the right human. So when I talk about robots in my book specifically, I'm mostly talking about search engine spiders, although a lot of the things we talk about in terms of descriptiveness, like using descriptiveness to help a robot find you, to help understand context. That can be applied to other types of robots or search as well. And so yeah, I think it really starts with the human, and then you tie in the robot, as long as you're not putting the human out to tie that robot in. And so, at the end of the day, the human's most important. And I think that even Google's founding principles or documentation would support that, because Google has always said, write for the human first, content is king, whatever sort of trite saying has derived from their own documentation, but it's true. And the way that they've evolved their algorithm is in line with that idea.
No, I would agree. I've always argued you could write for both, and a lot of people say you can't. I strongly disagree on that one.
Same.
Chapter 4 in the book, you talk about web content readability. And I think this is a real biggie. A lot of people write good stuff, but they don't format it well. Right. And by the way, to me, formatting even includes things like font sizes. I have a pet peeve with font sizes. We're all getting older. I don't know about you. I'm 55, Maddy, at this record. And my eyes aren't what they used to be. And I actually prefer to use a bit bigger font than the standard 12-inch font. What's your feeling around font sizes and formatting text?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you're making is that we will all access the internet in different ways throughout our lives. Yep. One thing is we age. And so that's just one thing to consider. But you have to also consider people who have other access issues, like if they're blind, if they have an injury that makes it harder to use a mouse, if their hand's broken or something. There's all these different things that affect that reader experience, that content experience in general. And so it is important to be considering that as you build really like the design where the content lives. And I think that my background in website design back in college and freelancing a little bit afterwards has helped me to see like the full picture of, it's not just about the design. It's not just about the words on the design. It's about how they work together to create a great experience. And I think beyond these different types of access issues that may have nothing to do with your product, there are also access issues that could have to do with your product. Like if you're marketing, say, for example, to somebody who's blind, then your content is going to have to be accessible to that person as a rule and not as an afterthought. So yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have any specific guidelines for how big font size should be, but certainly it should be big enough for, whoever you anticipate is going to be on your website, like the average person or even somebody to like the fringes of that. You should be planning for people with different types of access levels and maybe having like a tool that adjusts it, for example.
So well said. What do you think about tools like Grammarly and things like that? Do you think they help? Do you think they give a false sense of security? How's your feeling on it?
I think it's both. So we use Grammarly. I'll preface this by saying that every writer and editor on my team has a premium Grammarly subscription. And one of the reasons is so that we can essentially have the writers do their own basic self-edit so that we're not kind of wasting time on the proper spelling of, a word that has been misspelled. But I think what we use Grammarly for and where I think it really shines is it has this style guide feature where you can go in and say, for example, we're writing about WordPress. And as you and I know, WordPress has a capital P, as many other people don't necessarily seem to care about. They'll write it with a lowercase.
One of my biggest pet peeves is to leave the capital P out.
I mean, it sticks out like a sore thumb once you realize what the proper way to do it is. As with many other things within specific industries. Another one of my favorite examples is HubSpot, because so many people spell it with a lowercase s. It's actually a capital S.
Yes.
And so things like that, things where it's like, well, that's a word that's going to come up probably way more than once. We can add to Grammarly's style guide. And then what happens, just like any other Grammarly editing suggestion where it's kind of like a pop-up to the side of your editor that you're writing in, you can create basically custom pop-ups that say, oh, you spelled WordPress with a lowercase p. Why don't you change it to this? Because that's the right way to do it. And you can even add like a little explainer for why the rule is the way it is. And that's what I love about Grammarly.
So true. And you mentioned words. It gets even more confusing with American and Canadian spelling. Center is spelled differently. Totally. There's others. So I'm forever adding words into Grammarly and saying, no, it's just the Canadian spelling. I'm Canadian. I write the Canadian way. And that's the way it is, right? It's just SEO basics, which you spend unlucky chapter 13. I don't subscribe to that theory. I should tell you, I wore 13 on a hockey jersey for many, many years. So there you go. The biggest problem I think with SEO basics is people don't do the keyword research before they get to writing.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is what we were talking about before, the idea of writing for humans and robots, and some people just being like, no, I'm going to write for only the human. And it's like, we're not, by doing keyword research, you're not like taking away from that, right? Like you're adding to it.
Yeah, so true. And then you spent a large portion talking about one of my favorite things, CTAs, calls to action. And I'm glad you did, because I think before we even get to the writing part, I don't think web designers use enough CTAs on their website. And they forget the purpose of a website is to generate traffic, which leads to sales. And if you don't have a call to action, how do you generate that traffic?
Right. Yeah. And I think too, it's especially as a web designer, you're preoccupied with thinking about, well, how can I show off all my coding skills? How can I create something that's beautiful? And I think that aesthetics play into things, but maybe not to the same level that the average web developer is thinking about when they're, for example, creating a website for themselves. Because at the end of the day, sometimes, honestly, some of the most simple landing pages or sales pages or whatever, where I have one, for example, that I built on Paperform just because I wanted something that I could display stuff on, not have to think too much about the design, but that could also take payments. Every time that I share the resource that's living on those pages, it sells new, it's like a digital product. So it sells new digital downloads every time that I sell it. And it's just so simple. I haven't overthought it. I've underthought it, but it still works. And so thinking about that and the idea of clear calls to action, it's go into whatever you create, content, web pages, designs, you have to have that end goal in mind before you start, because it's going to affect how you put it together.
No question. And I would also suggest that people should personalize those CTAs, things like submit don't work really well. Watch your verbiage, get my free resource now, personalize them a little bit. And I think they have a better click through if you actually personalize them than make them generic personally. But
totally. Yeah. Or think through what the end result of what that person wants. And that should be the button. If I'm selling a resource, I'm just thinking back to that example of what I have on Paperform. One of them's a content brief template. And so it's maybe the CTA is something about being more prepared for your next piece of your next content project or something, get the resources you need to, kick butt at your next content project, something like that, but that ties it to the end goal.
So one of my favorite questions, which you didn't cover in the book, but I can ask it anyway, because you blog. And I made a decision in my business 3.5 years ago. I wasn't blogging anymore. For me, not for clients, for me.
Yeah.
And I jumped into this world of podcasting. So that's fine, which I actually do show notes for. But so I've done it a little differently. Is blogging dead in these days? And I ask that question because you might remember Darren Rose, pro blogger, who's been around for a long, long time. And when I started 10 or 11 years ago, Darren had the 30-day blog challenge, write a blog every day. And everybody was blogging madly then. Or does it still have value?
I think that it's just changed mediums maybe. And I think what it comes down to when you're creating content is to consider, first of all, like everybody has a different way of learning. Your audience might have a primary way of learning that you can kind of lean into. But I think if you just take the average population, some people are visual learners, some people can read it and learn it. Some people need like a mentor to walk them through things. Some people like to use their hands to understand like there's all these different intelligences and there's all these different learning styles. And so I think that, when we're creating content for our clients, part of it is thinking about, well, could we potentially like repurpose this into another medium, or how can we represent like a few different mediums within this piece of content? And it's things like, for example, maybe we'll embed a YouTube video that it doesn't have to be ours necessarily, but it explains a concept that maybe it doesn't make sense to fully get into in this written piece of content. Or another way that I always think about this is like statistics. It's hard for me to read, for example, a comparative stat and be able to understand that. I'm not a super math-brained person to begin with, so that's already kind of working against me. But if I see a visual that's like a, bar chart or like a pie graph or something that's representing that written statistic in a way that my mind can make sense of it, then that particular piece of content has so much more impact on me than if I were to like, skim over that statistic and kind of just be like, okay, whatever, like continue to go through the article because I just didn't really understand.
No, I agree with you. And thanks for a great explanation. If somebody wanted to improve their writing, what's the top 3 things you would tell them to do, Maddy?
Well, I think they should take a page out of your book and try to read a book once a week, or at least maybe once a month, but just to get into a practice of reading, because I think that, and I'm very similar to you, I try to read a book a week. It's a little bit all over the place this year, but for the past several years, I've done that. And what I try to do, especially if I'm using like my Kindle, for example, because I don't really like to mark up a print copy of a book, but if I'm using my Kindle, I'll highlight every word I don't know, turns of phrase that are, especially delicious that I want to savor and think on later. And I guess just anything that makes me think, that gives me something to think about. So I think that's one really major thing is to read, but also like to kind of take notes while you read. Not anything major, but yeah, just like things that you want to investigate later. I would say number 2 would probably be to find like a mentor and or somebody that you can kind of trade off sharing feedback on each other's work. Just somebody who's outside of your own head, your own personal bias. It can be really easy to get stuck in your own world and your own box. So having somebody who can give you some, good feedback and who's not worried about offending you would be a second really solid thing to do. And then I think the last thing is to just write and to maybe find like some prompts, if you're having trouble. Like one thing that I do that I think anybody could do, and I don't do it consistently, and I should, because consistency makes everything better, but morning pages, which is a concept from the book The Artist's Way, which had a huge impact on me in terms of sort of like manufacturing creativity when I'm not feeling creative. But the idea behind morning pages is that you spend the first part of your day before you like jump into any projects, before you jump into work, and you just like write. You just kind of like journal, like any thoughts that are on your mind, anything that's like holding you back. And the idea is that you're kind of confronting your inner censor by just writing and acknowledging what you're thinking. So I think that's one great way that you can cultivate writing.
And journaling has so many other benefits besides improving your writing, like getting your thoughts out, writing for yourself, working on frustrations. It's good for the headspace. Yeah. I journaled, probably for about 21 years or so, give or take, every day, all day. I used to do it on paper. And I've now, believe it or not, moved to a Google Doc just because. That's what I do too. My phone is in my pocket, and if I'm out and about and I want to add to that journal, I can add it while I'm running around. It's like, and by the way, my journal is not for anybody's consumption. My partner keeps saying, "Can I read that?" No. My mom says, "Can I read that?" No, because you don't want to read it.
Right. You don't want anybody to censor you, including yourself, which is why it should be kept private. You could take snippets from it if it feels relevant to share with others, but I would keep it. I agree that it should be a private thing. And and I agree that it can be a tool that has benefits to you that goes so far beyond writing. I'll give you a couple prompts that I put in mine that might be helpful. One of them is, what am I excited about today? So just kind of sets the mood up nicely. What am I grateful for, so that I can practice gratitude and recognize, the things in my life that have gone really well. I also do what am I worried about? That's something I added on recently just so that I could get it out of my head, put it.
That's a great idea. From a mental health standpoint, that's amazing. And it's funny, you talk about some of the stuff you're sharing. And in my journal, we did a date night the other night, and I wrote a piece in my journal. How did the date night make me feel?
Nice.
Things like that, right? It's just, it's not all negativity. It's just.
No, not at all. Negativity is maybe even the minority of it. It's just getting your thoughts out and sort of making sense of them, I think.
Yeah, so true. Maddy, this has been absolutely wonderful. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, how's the best way to reach out?
Sure. I would say check out theblogsmith.com if you're interested in any sort of help or mentoring around content. I'm super active on Twitter. @Maddy Osman is my handle. And then, if you liked what we talked about today, check out my book on Amazon. It's called Writing for Humans and Robots, The New Rules of Content Style. And it is a bestseller in the SEO category. So far, Rob included, people like it.
Yeah, I do. I've actually already purchased 4 extra copies for gifts. Ooh. So that's how much I think it's important. And I love what you've done. And what I'll tell you is you're very approachable on Twitter. So anybody who's worried about reaching out to Maddy, she does get back to you.
Absolutely.
And it's always wonderful to talk to you, Maddy. Thank you very much. And you have yourself a great day.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. This episode of the SDM Show is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency to handle all your WordPress website security needs. Go on over to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and find out how we can help you secure your website so you no longer have an issue with backups, being hacked, or your website being compromised. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. A very special thank you to Maddy for joining me on this edition of the SDM Show. Thank you for listening to this edition of the SDM Show. The SDM Show is brought to you by Rob Cairns and Stunning Digital Marketing. For more information about Rob Cairns and Stunning Digital Marketing, go to stunningdigitalmarketing.info. From here, you can connect to us on social media, go to our website, and even go to the podcast to subscribe. This podcast is dedicated to my late father, Bruce Cairns. Dad, I miss you very much. Keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars. Make your business succeed.